This is Karen with NewClevelandRadio.net, and it is time for the Intentionality Gurus with Candace Pollock. Now, don't worry, you really haven't missed a podcast. We've been on hiatus for about a week or two, but we are back today, and the subject is conflict rules. And after our pre-conversation before Candace and I came online today, I'm now really curious what this means.
So we've been talking about conflict, mostly based on the book by Liane Davey called The Good Fight. And the subtitle of it is Use Productive Conflict to Get Your Team and Organization Back on Track. But everything that we've talked about, even previously with the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership and some of the other material, was talking in terms of, in the context of an organization, can be applied to families, our personal lives and so on. And in fact, at the end of the book, Liane Davey is talking about uses at home and everywhere else. So the idea behind conflict rules is you can create some rules around how you deal with conflict.
Okay.
So, and you had said in that little pre-talk that we don't talk about the content of the podcast beforehand, but you said you don't like rules.
Well, it's not that, I like rules, but I don't like rules. Okay. And I know that's a conflict right there.
Rules, but not other people's rules.
Right. I like rules if they make sense. I feel like we're living in a world right now where there's all these rules, but they're being broken because they don't make any sense. And it's like, so what do you follow? And I'll just give you one example. I was supposed to have a doctor appointment yesterday morning, and I went there, and guess what? The doctor's office had moved. Nobody told me. They had actually changed my appointment from yesterday to tomorrow. Nobody told me. And I was supposed to have some lab tests done, but I didn't have the requisition. And again, nobody sent it to me. And yet I was told when I made this appointment, my appointment was going to be at a very specific place. These are the things that were going to happen at that appointment, and I should expect to be there for 2 hours. So I followed all the rules, and yet all the rules got broken. And that's frustrating.
There should have been some kind of rule internally at the doctor's office to make sure that changed.
Right. Tell the patient that we have moved across the street in a third of a mile down the road. Tell the patient that her appointment has changed. In fact, on the hospital web portal where I go to check my appointments, it's scheduled for yesterday at the old location. So it's not like I missed something.
Right.
So
but it's frustrating nonetheless because your objective could not have been met. It was just an impossibility.
Exactly. And I just see this happening in so many places. How do we teach children to follow the rules if the rules, we're allowing them to be broken and we're breaking them along the way? It's a scary world for me right now.
Well, and an underlying element to me is that there was just a total lack, a void of understanding how it may impact the end user, you.
Right, exactly.
It's from the provider's perspective, not the end user's perspective. And that actually is relevant to what we'll talk about tonight.
Okay.
So, the material that we've covered so far of Liane Davey's, and, I've been kind of an unabashed fan of her work because I just love what she has to say, which is that most of us are conflict avoidant. we let things pile up and build up steam. And then by the time we end up having some kind of conversation, assuming it's just a conversation and not a fight, things are out of proportion and highly charged, and often don't lead to a good outcome because we're beyond that point. We don't have the ability to speak rationally and calmly and dispassionately.
Right.
So the whole idea is to say the things we need to say early rather than stepping around the elephant in the room. And that's very much a factor in organizations, even small firms, but certainly families. And we touched on that in a couple of the other podcasts. So when it comes to putting things into rules, she calls it codifying conflict. So basically creating a code, like a set of statutes or something around how a group, including a family group or other people, could be a committee, all sorts of things, agree to operate. In some settings, I've been exposed to the idea of terms of engagement, meaning in solo to small law firm settings. I coach a lot of solo to small law firm attorneys and their teams. And one of the things they do to create their culture is to have a whole conversation about how they agree to hold each other accountable. What are the things they're allowed to say? When there's some misunderstanding, how do they resolve it, and so on. And I have observed, it's probably now 15 years, over the years, the teams that were really solid on those terms of engagement, not just this lip service, our mission is this, all of that stuff, but real kind of, granular ideas about how we're going to be able to talk to each other when things are tense, etc. Those teams tended to be very productive and supportive and effective, whereas the teams that just gave lip service to it or adopted somebody else's terms of agreement or engagement didn't do well. So in your interactions, where has that been lacking or present?
It's been very lacking in almost every situation I can think of. I know in corporate America, and it's been 10 years since I've been out of it, but I still keep reflecting on the fact that we would, at the beginning of every year, there would be a mission statement. And basically, as you talked about, this is how we would communicate things. This is the direction you would go. This is, and there were processes and they were written out. And yet by the second day of business, nobody was following them. Okay. I'm that person who keeps saying, well, no, this is the policy. I'm following it. And everybody, is looking at me like I'm growing horns out of my head because I'm following a process. And it's like, well, isn't this what we agreed upon? And then I would hear, yes, but yeah, we just don't want to do it that way. And so I found myself walking around holding things in because nobody wanted to follow the process. And when I've even tried doing that here at home, it doesn't work. I have two men in my life here that, we did agree. That's how we would sit down and discuss something. But you know what? It just, I don't even want to discuss it right now. Yeah. And so I look at myself in the mirror and I go, why am I the one who follows the rules? And the people who I engage with have no desire to follow the rules. And yet I don't know how not to.
And what do the rules represent to you?
The rules to me represent a logical way of processing whatever information needs to be processed. How do you have a conversation with somebody when you don't have it have the information laid out in a logical way so everybody can understand it, rather than just, getting upset because their voice is too loud. Well, if there's a process to keep our voices down, you would follow that linear, concept.
So the idea is that there's not a commonality of ways of approaching a conversation. Some people can get defensive, shut it down. Other people just want to broach the topic, see what you might accomplish by talking about it. And other people may have a third or fourth or fifth outcome
Sure.
from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so it underscores the point that everybody has a different perspective about how they like to deal or don't like to deal with something that's unpleasant, or they just, they want to be working on something else. I had some people that I shared office space with years ago, and we had agreed to a 5-year lease. And there were, I think there were 5 or 6 of us, I forget how many. And we were approaching the end of that lease. And so the conversation was, are we going to, negotiate with the landlords for another increment? And so I raised the topic. We were having a group meeting. And remember, these were all lawyers. So,
right.
That's a bit of an element all by itself. And they said something or other about, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And I said, well, but that presupposes that everybody is still going to move forward together. And one of the people in the room, literally jumped up and started screaming at me. And it's like, I thought it was a very reasonable comment. It wasn't said in any kind of aggressive way. And as it turns out, I didn't know this ahead of time, but one of the people in the room was choosing not to move forward. So it was a relevant fact,
Sure.
Are all 5 or 6 people moving forward or not, because it's going to impact us all. So the point of that is, I was ill prepared for that. I felt like I almost got verbally stomped on for merely saying, is everybody moving forward? Can we assume that everybody's moving forward? So in the context of, that group, I think it was just specific to that particular group. We never would have been able to successfully have a conversation about our rules of engagement. It just, as it turns out, we ultimately spent 15 years in the same suite together, but it was always a little lumpy, let me put it that way. So the point is to be conscious that conflict is going to be present in our lives. And so the fork in the road, that metaphor we use a lot, is we can deal with it as if it's like, surprise, there's going to conflict, or we can deal with it. Okay, how are we going to deal with conflict? And so Liane Davey has several chapters on it, but basically she's saying we have to consciously create it. It's kind of like that terms of engagement, by being clear about what our expectations are. And some of the other material we've covered is to be clear about what we have control over and what we don't have control over. So we don't have control over necessarily the other person's reactions.
Right.
We've covered that. We have control over, how we proceed and how we can set things up. But then her second, so setting expectations is really important. And part of it is, with the idea that the ultimate goal is to build productive conflict, which it seems a little, like it's a contrary concept. But when you think about conflict resilience, for me, that was a different shift. I don't know how it lands on you.
Well, conflict resilience is that you're getting, either you learn something from it, or you can at least move forward.
Yeah, as opposed to being conflict avoidant at a higher cost than being able to deal with, that kind of upset. So over time with that group of people, that other person never changed. He was a litigator, so that's kind of in his DNA. And I always, I had the image most of the time. This is how I was able to diffuse my upset, of a little terrier dog on my pant leg, not letting go. So then it's like, okay, let this person be that way. But the idea is to know that and to state that we'd have to be able to deal with these things in a particular way and normalize tension, not by saying we want it, but we know that it's going to be a natural byproduct. And that normalizing tension by saying dissent is acceptable. Because what we've talked about in prior podcasts is, there are a lot of people that want to raise the topics, like you were saying, and you feel like you're the lone voice. Why can't we follow the rules? Or, what are the rules for if we're not following them? So the idea is to be able to have that culture that says conflict or dissent is acceptable, and learn to surf the uncomfortableness. So I got really good at that with my office mates. And, they were good people. It's just that some had an unfortunate communication style. And then the other is fighting clean. So that can be hard when it's one-sided. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, because not everybody has that same image of what clean is. Mm-hmm. And I sometimes notice that, in our family dynamic here, we all interpret words or actions based on, what we've seen in the past. And I think I've mentioned this before. My son speaks in a very loud voice almost all the time. And so when he gets excited, obviously his voice gets louder. And if I'm not paying attention to the words he's really using, and I just hear his voice, sometimes, I get my back up at thinking that he's mad or angry, and being very forceful. And he's really not. But that's what I'm hearing because I'm not listening to his words.
Yeah, and it may have some historical triggers for you of other situations.
Sure.
Where somebody has, raised the level of their volume. And I think I've mentioned before, my dad was a big man, a tall man, and had a deep, powerful voice. And he had 3 daughters who were easily cried. And sometimes we wouldn't hear him say with frustration, I'm not yelling, I'm just being emphatic.
Right.
And he wasn't yelling at us, but, for us, it was like, oh, he's upset with us. And he might have said something really mundane. So to be able to recognize when somebody's just being emphatic, perhaps.
Right.
So the idea of being able to surf the uncomfortableness, that's something only we have control over. We can't necessarily, we can invite the others to do the same thing, but it doesn't mean that they will. And then the other part I really liked in this part about codifying the conflict was make the conflict frequent and small.
Make it frequent. I mean, I understand making it small, so you're not.
So
why frequent?
Like how do you eat a brontosaurus? One bite at a time.
Right.
So same thing with conflict. So deal with them before it's conflict with a capital C. It's maybe a disagreement or however you want to represent the idea that. So I had an episode with someone I work with, another person I work with, and we had a really good relationship in terms of being candid, being able to say what needed to be said, and so on. And we had one conversation, we had deviated from that quite a bit, but I could always rely on this person to tell me what was so for her. And she could count on me to do that. So we didn't have to look for the subtext on the stuff that we weren't, it wasn't being said, which takes a lot of the tension out of the conversation. But something happened and we both took a turn that ended up, we had a little bit of a spark. And I reflexively held up my hand like, stop. And that was a trigger for her. But fortunately, she said, don't put up your hand. That triggers me. And I recognize, my reflex.
Sure.
And I could appreciate it. And that thing that could have boiled over and have become a real sore spot for us, in future interactions, how sometimes those things happen, it got fizzled right there. It was taken care of right there. So that would be a perfect example of something, I can't even remember what it was. I mean, that's, the perfect kind of
Sure.
conflict that, it blew over as fast as it started. But we had that prior agreement that we needed to be candid with each other and could rely and trust that the other would be candid, kind but candid.
Right.
So the whole idea is it was small enough that it didn't become a festering sore. So any opportunities for you?
Well, it begins with, starting with that conversation almost from the beginning when you are meeting somebody or working with somebody. So on my weekend job, I have a manager every once in a while. He'll send me an email that just, sort of irks me. And I just have to take a step back and realize he's not being mean. Okay. It just may happen to be the tone of his voice. And so we have this agreement that I can call him when I get an email that makes me feel like he's berating me or something, and just point blank ask, did I really do something wrong? And half the time or more than that, he'll say to me, no, what makes you ask? And then I'll go right to the subtext and I'll read it to him. And typically when I read it back out loud, then I realize, I read it wrong. But if I haven't, we'll have a conversation about it. And why I react that way with him, I'm not sure, other than, it takes me back maybe to previous managers or whatever that, may have been unkind to me. But being able to have that communication with them, we just knock it out, like you said, one bite at a time.
And it builds trust over time. And then that enhances future interactions so that the conflict doesn't necessarily become an issue.
Right, exactly.
And that's the whole point, because with that individual that I described where I held up my hand, it was just that I was that person started talking to me in a more hostile, excitable tone. And then that was, like putting kerosene on the fire when I held up my hand. And she said it, I recognized it, like, well, what was I thinking? So, but the point is, now I will not ever do that again, even though I don't see that person very often. So in this context, you see how it can be used at home or elsewhere? I mean, not just—
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Okay. And then the fighting clean and cultivating productive conflict, or, conflict resilience is, make it small and frequent, and consciously cultivate the skills around conflict. Identify the stakeholders in the situation. So, in the work setting, that might be the end users, the customers, it might be, even higher up management, it might be another department or whatever. But in a family, it could be the immediate family and maybe, some grandparents or, people who are not in the direct household. And then adopt the other side's view. So what might that look like?
Well, if you take their view into consideration, it can, at least for me, it helps me make my point less aggressive and not thinking about them as being aggressive towards me. So like tonight, my husband happens to be out of town. My son and I are going to order dinner after this podcast. And typically, when we make these plans, he's not ready when I'm ready. So like when I'm finished and I go say, okay, now let's go order dinner. Typically he'll look at me and say, I'm not ready right now, or I'm in the middle of something and whatever. And I would get my back up. But anticipating where he may be coming from would help diffuse the conflict.
Yeah, and it may not rise to a level of a conflict.
Right.
Because you did that. Years and years ago, I was on a jury duty, and it was something that should have been done in a day or two, but it ended up lasting a whole week with the jury, threatening to be a hung jury and so on. It was really kind of pitiful. But part of the problem was that it was on a criminal matter, and there were 6 people who said the person was guilty, 4 people who said he was not guilty, and 2 people said undecided. But then nobody budged from that viewpoint for several days. And so we had the opening arguments, and the entire trial on Monday was done in that one day, not even the full day. We went into deliberations Monday afternoon, and then we finished them late Friday. And it wasn't until on Friday we finally got people, I was one of the undecideds, but got people to actually trade viewpoints. So I had to become a guilty or not guilty person, and the guilty people had to become not guilty, make arguments, and vice versa. And it was when that happened, we all shifted, all right? And it was not a hung jury. But the point was, nobody could even embrace that whole idea until that last day. Maybe it was because nobody wanted to go into a second week of deliberations. But the point was, there was something to be had by trying on the other viewpoint. Everybody learned something from it.
Well, and that's why when they say, if you don't understand somebody, try to walk in their shoes, try to see, what they're experiencing. I have a friend who's going through some hard times, and part of me looks at this person and I say, you've created it yourself. But even if they have, they're still going through hard times. Okay. And so my first reaction is, hey, it's all your fault. But that doesn't correct it. And so I've had to step out and say, okay, I might do the same thing, and it could be my fault. Now, what are some of the things that I could do to change it? And we've been having those conversations over the last couple months. And it's interesting that, this person is slowly making good choices, whereas previously those choices were, I'm just going to keep walking down this path because this is the only path I know. And when they said that to me, I was surprised because they're highly educated. They're very, involved in so many activities. And so my thought was, they know better, but even though they do, they like the comfortable, even when the comfortable becomes uncomfortable.
Develop blind spots because of that. It's that not seeing those forks in the road that we always talk about.
Right, exactly.
Suddenly they become obvious. Well, there are a few more things that Liane talks about. So improving our skills around feedback. And so I think I've mentioned before, I did a program in 2001, actually. I remember because it was on the first day of September 11th. And it was all about listening skills. And the idea is that we listen for the emotional message that's being sent to us, consciously or unconsciously, by the other person, and then reflect back that emotional message, not as a question and not by saying, oh, it sounds like you're saying such and such, because, that can push my buttons. But that tends not to be very effective. It's just basically saying you're feeling challenged by such and such, for instance, if the conversation was around that. Liane Davey's material says to make it the feedback, your objective observations of the other person's behaviors has to be objective and observations, not subjective. And then coupled with the subjective impact it has on you. Okay, so when that person and I were having that interaction, that person was raising their voice, becoming louder, and a couple of other things. That was it was actually subjective, but my objective observation was that her voice was becoming louder. And my subjective impact was I was feeling attacked, and I put up my hand to halt it. I was in overwhelm, all right? So if I had had the presence of mind to say that, and if we hadn't had some prior conversations about how we agreed to operate with each other, I might not have been able to diffuse that. We might not have been able to diffuse
Sure.
that. So any episodes you can think of where you've been able to or not able to? I can think of one.
Go right ahead. I'll let you do it this time.
Well, the one that you had relatively recently about how you put your message out there on the table and allowed the person to pick it up or not.
Yep.
And how did that feel?
You know, after we talked and, did the show, when I did it, internally, I felt horrible. Okay. Because it was like, this is something new that I'm really doing. But when I said it in those words, I'm putting this on the table for you to see, and, did that imagery of pushing it. And then I, told them what was on my mind. It was like, oh, I had no idea. And it was like, so I was making it worse internally. And if we hadn't done that podcast at that time, I'm not sure how the relationship would be today, because I just didn't want to upset myself or them. And yet I knew I had to do something.
And you did, and it had an reasonably okay outcome.
Right.
Okay. So that is a perfect example that you were able to be somewhat objective, put it out there. Then you would have been able to observe that person, and that probably wasn't the response you were expecting.
No, absolutely not.
And so, for whatever reason, you created that space where that was possible.
Right.
So kudos for you on that. So then the other part she talks about is using humor and code words to diffuse some of the potential triggers and so on. So one of the code words in one of the groups that I belong to, rather than saying, basically when somebody wants to come back and correct you on something, is are you open to some respectful pushback? All right, I call it being candid candy. That's my little, code word.
Yeah.
And like lay it on me, because I gave up mind reading a few years ago. But everybody can have their own little phrases and so on. That it's just the signal that is it okay for me to be candid? Is it okay for me to say what I need to say, and so on. So any code words or humor you could use around that, like a family joke or something like that?
I got to figure that one out.
Okay. or maybe somebody else can figure it out, and so on. And then finally, to always thank people when they get through the trial and error of this conflict resilience. So it's got to be done. It's out there. It's everywhere we look anymore, right?
Oh, it's, so what happened yesterday with the doctor's office was like the beginning of this rolling stone, gathering up all these things that could aggravate me. And my husband had gone with me because he had yesterday off. And whole idea was that after my doctor appointment, we were going to spend the day together. We were going to go to the art museum. We had all these things. And of course, I got in the car and it was like, just take me home. I just don't want to deal with any of this. And my husband loves to tease me. And we've been together 40 years and I should know this. Okay. But you tease me when I'm already upset about something, it's not the right time.
Maybe he should already know this.
Well, and he should, and he does. But as he said to me when we finally discussed it this morning, it took us a day to really discuss it. He said, more than 50% of the time, his teasing brings me back to a calmer state. He said, at first, you put your back up and then you start to laugh and then you're okay. And I said, but it's the other times when you don't see it's not working, you just keep it going. And he looked at me this morning. He goes, I never thought about that. He said, I kept waiting for the results that I see.
Pushing for the result.
Right. And as soon as he said that, it was like, I can be mad at him for it yesterday. But now that he said that, it's like, you're right. Most of the time, the results are positive. I snap out of it. I realize, hey, that it happened. It's dealt with, and I don't need to worry about it anymore. But yesterday, that didn't work. And, and it was like constant all day long, every other word out of his mouth. At least I heard he was teasing me, whether he was or not, that's what I heard. And so when we talked about it this morning, it was like, well, that makes sense because that's part of his personality to break the ice, to get back to an even place. So hopefully I will remember that in the future.
It sounds to me like you would, because may I ask, how was it that y'all came to talk about it this morning?
So he has this overnight project today that he had to go to, and he really didn't want to go, but he knew he had to. And he just said, I don't want to go until we resolve what happened yesterday. It's not, that we, had a real argument. It was just a very distant day between the two of us. And as soon as he said that, I realized, well, I don't want you going out of town either without it being resolved, because that's not fair to either one of us. So that's how it all came about. And it, was like, a light bulb, as you could see, it's almost like I could see the light bulb going off over his head and he saw going off over my head as we were talking. It was like, okay, maybe I tease too much, but, I've been doing it for 40 plus years, so don't expect it's going to stop tomorrow. And my response was, just remember that there are times that the teasing, you're going to have to just stop. You're going to have to read my body language if you're not listening to my words. So
yeah, and
we'll work on it.
And it sounds to me just the fact that you had that meeting of the minds in terms of not wanting it to continue without having a conversation was huge.
Exactly.
So that's a perfect example of dealing with conflict.
Well,
good
we
job.
did real well today.
You did real well all the way around.
Absolutely. So I can't wait for the next information that we're going to start working on. I'll keep it a secret right now. We will publish it right before our next show. But in the meantime, I understand that summer's going to linger for about another 10 days because I was watching the news before. So enjoy the next 10 days because they say after that it's going to get cold and rainy. So if wherever you are, enjoy the weather, take a deep breath, and let's resolve conflicts so that we can live a happier life.
A resilient life.
Resilient life. Like that word.
Sounds
Have
good.
a great day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.